much of what we learn about God in our early years comes from Genesis. There's a lot of reasons for that, but it does. Most all the kids' classes, most all the things that we hear, most all the various things, they all seem to come from Genesis. And then later on, as we get older, we refer to it frequently, but we don't really go back and study it all that much because, well, we know those stories. And so, we're supposed to study the whole Bible, and maybe once in a while we should go back and look at some of those first stories. As far as we know, the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about Adam and Eve, really. But if we start with them, they were faithful to God, but it seems, and we can't really tell about all the different things that happened to them that are not recorded, but it seems that they were faithful to God until they weren't. And how long it was before they were not faithful, we really don't know. But at least in the words that we have, it wasn't very long. Again, we don't really know that. But sin entered their lives, and that's about the story. Now, granted, there is some more detail, but that's pretty much the story. The only thing we know about Abel was that his offering was acceptable to God, and that Cain's wasn't, and that Cain killed it. Again, there's a little bit more to that story, but there aren't chapters and chapters and chapters talking about their lives. There's just very little about them. They stand out by having faith in the case of Adam and Eve, and then not having faith. They stand out in the case of Abel of having faith and being killed. They stand out in the case of Cain as not having faith. But again, we don't know much about any of those characters except the little bit of the story that we hear from them. So we just don't know about them. We don't know about several generations after them. About the first thing that comes to us next is in Genesis 5, and we hear about Enoch. And again, we read and use Enoch as an example of someone who was faithful to God, who walked with God, and God took it. God saw to it that he did not have to face death. But what else do we know about Enoch? We don't know really anything. Now, does that harm us anyway? Does that leave us without enough information to know anything? Well, it's one of those cases like some of the others that might be interesting to hear more, but that's what we have. And so when we start talking about Enoch, really all we can do is talk about his faith and how his great faith caused God to see to it that he did not see death. But when you look at these characters, and using Enoch as the example, that implies that there weren't others as good. There weren't others as well behaved. There weren't others who were as faithful. If there were others that were as faithful as Enoch, my logic would tell me that God would have treated them the same way. I can't prove that either, but it looks like that Enoch was an exceptionally faithful person to God. That's what I get from his story. Enoch is singled out to be given this great blessing because of his great faith in God. Enoch was taken by God. And if we look at that, it was not done in a vacuum, because we know the story now, thousands and thousands of years later. They knew the story then. Other people at his time, they knew that. So they saw God's power, and they knew God, and they knew what he had done, because now we look back and we see, well, Adam and Eve was however many thousands of years ago, and these great characters of faith were how many years ago, and thousands of years ago. We know of them. We don't know a lot, but we know of them. But no one else was taken like Enoch. Now, again, Elijah was long, long, long later, but at that time, no one else was taken except Enoch. Enoch's son was Methuselah. All we really know about Methuselah was that he lived the longest of anybody, 969 years. that lived longer than that, but as far as I can tell from reading the Bible, we don't know anything else other than that. We know two things. He was Enoch's son, and he lived 969 years. And he was 300 years old. Now, things were different in those days. You can't really compare 969 years to us or anything like that, but you can still say that he was 300 years old when Enoch was taken to God. So he was clearly old enough to know what was going on. We can't say everything, but we can say some things. Enoch was taken to God when his son was 300 years old. And so 669 years later, Methuselah died. And he died the year of the flood. Now, some could say he died in the flood. Some could say he died before the flood, but he died in the flood. Now, if you think of yourself and think of what happened at that time, Noah had been teaching. Noah found grace in the sight of God, and Noah had been teaching for, we'll just say, 100 years before the flood. And Methuselah heard that, and everybody else heard it too. But Noah and his family were all that God saved, and all the rest were considered evil in the sight of God, and evil, the world was filled with evil. And yet they saw God take Enoch, or they knew about it. Some saw it, some I'm sure heard about it. Everybody wasn't watching that day that was in the world, but they all heard about it. And they knew all these other things. So Noah is singled out. He lived 350 years after the flood. And we look as we read through Genesis, the next thing we see in Genesis, again, not every single detail, but the next real big event in Genesis is the Tower of Babel. And some can look at different timelines, and if you believe those timelines, and there's certainly differences of opinion on exactly all these years, how they all fit together. But some would say that Noah saw the Tower of Babel being built before he died. And to think that his children and their children were the ones that did that is just kind of hard to imagine that they were still alive when this great evil was done to God and against God. But the point being that very little time passed between the flood and then when all that were saved were 8 people, to this building of the tower, which God saw as wrong. And the next generation or so, as I say, were those that did that. Those that could know Noah and see Noah there. Granted, he was probably pretty old, but he was still there and still faithful to God. And so we can see from these stories that it seems like a short time between the time Adam and Eve were acceptable, Abel was acceptable, Enoch was acceptable, Noah was acceptable, and that's all we know about. There's just, you would think in those generations there would be more. There would be more that were singled out, but they weren't. Very few that we know about were good. Most we know were evil. God tells us in Matthew 7, 13, and 14 that the way to destruction is broad. I should just read that. Matthew 7, 13, and 14. It says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. And those who find it are few." He goes on and talks about false prophets and those other kinds of things. But the point that I'm trying to make is there is a broad way and there is a narrow way. And as we can see from the first few chapters of Genesis, based on what we can read, very few found it. Most chose evil, chose to go against God over several generations. So again, we don't know how broad the way is. We don't know how narrow the way is. But we do know the difference between those two words in English. We know the difference between few and many. We know the difference between broad and narrow. We know that those that believed in God in the first part of Genesis were few and far between. As we read through the rest of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we still see that those that were faithful to God and then obeyed Christ were few. Again, we are not going to count, but the fewness is important to realize. And so, if we believe in Jesus, we will be numbered with the few. Again, I hope the few is a larger number than what we see in the first few chapters of Genesis. And I think it is. I think a lot of time has passed and a lot of preaching has been done, a lot of talk, a lot of teaching has been done. But the bottom line of all this is whether we are one who witnessed Enoch being taken up by God, whether we were Noah building an ark, whether we were Abel trying to show his faith in God, and those others that I mentioned, and others, a lot of others that I didn't. We want to make sure we're one of those few. And we strive to do that every day. I'm not saying that we do strive. We need to strive to do that every day, to be that kind of person that Jesus will find to be acceptable and that God will welcome us into heaven to be with him. We don't know how many the few are, but we know there's more that won't. And we need to try our best to make the few larger than it is. That's our job as Christians. We need to, first of all, accept his word. Everybody here is a Christian tonight, so we won't go through those steps. But we know we have to accept him. And by accepting and believing, it doesn't mean believe of, it means believe in. And that means obey. Do what we're told. Try our best to teach others. God gave us all gifts that we need to use in his service. We need to make sure that we do the things that we're able to do to be helpful in the kingdom. Let's think on these things while we stand and sing.
The voice of the Savior has come. The cross where he died is in sight. He knelt at the cross, there is room. Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? The bride and the Spirit invite. Are you coming to Jesus tonight? The voice of the Father implores from mercy's most wonderful light. His love in that calm he outpours. Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? Are you coming to Jesus tonight? The bride and the Spirit invite. Are you coming to Jesus tonight?